The Sea Ranch Forum Steering Committee is an independent group, not an arm of TSRA. Our goal is to present forums that are relevant to life on the Sea Ranch. In many cases, our interests run parallel with the communication interests of TSRA committees and we cooperate with those groups in presenting forums. However, our greatest value to the Sea Ranch is in presenting information outside the formalities of TSRA. And of course today we're going to go into the formalities of TSRA a little bit, but I'm going to let Tim tell you about that. First of all, I'd like to point out, in case anyone's missed them, the exits are here. The restrooms are across the way. We will have how long? 45 minutes presentation. Then there will be a break, and then we will come back for a question and answer period. Are there any announcements? Mary D doesn't have any announcements. Okay, I have an announcement. The forum for next month will be held on September 2nd, and that's a busy day, and I hope that people will be able to come out for it because the Point Arena Lighthouse Board will give a presentation on the rich past of the 1870 and 1908 Point Arena lighthouses. They will talk about current opportunities for volunteering and also future plans for the restoration of the lighthouse will be presented. And as a special perk, there will be a wine and cheese reception at which everyone present will receive a commemorative wine glass. So hopefully you will mark that on your calendar, September 2nd at 3 o'clock here in this very room and be here. Now, Tim Tyler is going to introduce the forum.
I am Tim Tyler, and I just wanted to be sure that you all recognize that this is a real John Fox here today. For those of you who've seen him all over Sea Ranch in every meeting and thought he was cloned, this is the real John Fox. He's been here for a year now. And the first community manager that I introduced at a forum, I made the statement that he had the toughest job in the world because he had to deal with us. And he saw fit to correct me and say that no, he thought that the President of the United States had a slightly harder job. That was before 9/11. And the only thing that I have to say today is the fact that John Fox is not qualified constitutionally to be President of the United States. And that is the United States' loss, and it's our gain. And with that, I'll turn it over to John.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction, Tim and Nancy. And thanks to the Forum Committee for inviting me back 1 year after our first appearance here. It's almost exactly 1 year. And it's been a wonderful year, a challenging year, and we appreciate all of the warmth and generosity. Thanks to the Forum Committee and to the Association members for being here today. You could very well be somewhere else and enjoying the Sea Ranch and environment. The fact that you would want to come and listen to a talk about something as esoteric as local government speaks a lot, I think, about the community and its members. I'd like to make a couple of introductions, if I may, of my sister and brother-in-law. Janet and Clive are here to visit us for a vacation. Would you mind standing up so that you can see? They braved the Thursday travel chaos from London and got caught up in all of that business. And I think at least one member of the couple might have thought about turning around. But we're so glad that you didn't. The title of this discussion, and I really want it to be a discussion and not a monologue. Monologues can be very tedious. And certainly in the second half we'll have a chance to have more of a conversation, but even this part can be a conversation. The title is Personal Perspectives on Local Government, including Community Associations. I'm using community associations there as a term to embrace all types, and there are several of common interest developments, of which the Sea Ranch is, of course, one of those types, but there are others such as condominium developments and so forth. For simplicity of discussion, I've lumped them all together in the following discussion and analysis. The subtitle is, Would you go shopping for a form of government? If you think about that concept, it really is quite a revolutionary idea, and I don't know how many of you may have thought about that when you purchased property at the Sea Ranch, or thought about coming to the Sea Ranch as a place to own property and live. It's an appealing idea to me that one would sort of characterize in your mind the form of government that was most appealing to you, and then say, well, that's the sort of lifestyle I'd like to lead and the kind of government I'd like to have. And that really is the central theme of the discussion that I've prepared for you, is to try to characterize and distinguish this form of government that we enjoy here at the Sea Ranch and in thousands of other associations around the United States. Did anybody ever think about shopping for a form of government? Is that too revolutionary? It's in fact, in a way, what we were all doing at the time we made a decision to buy property here and to become part of the community. So that's the topic for the day. There are a couple of disclaimers that I need to insert here right at the beginning. One has already been explained by Nancy. This is not an association meeting or function that we're having here today. And the forum operates entirely independently from the board of directors. The other disclaimer I'd like to make is that all of the opinions you'll hear today, or explanations, they reflect my own perspectives and opinions. They're personal to me. The board has not reviewed or sanctioned any of these thoughts or ideas, and you never know, some of them may be so different from what the board thinks that I might get into trouble. The board has absolutely nothing to do with this. They're my reflections, and for whatever value they might have to you, I give them to you. The other disclaimer is that discussion of forms of private government in the United States is a very complex and quite well-researched issue. And if you go to the literature, you'll find views which express everything from this is a very good thing to be doing to this is the worst thing you could possibly be doing. And all of those viewpoints are in the literature. And on the back table, as you go to intermission, you'll see some books which contain references to the academic literature on forms of local government in the United States. And so if you want further information, it's there for you, or I can give it to you. But the point I want you to know, I don't want you to think that what I say about local government is the way it is. It's just the way I look at it and the way I have experienced it throughout my life. And so there's an awful lot of room for disagreement about many of the concepts involved here and that we'll be discussing. Also, I'd like to let you know that it's not necessary for you to take any notes today. The content of the talk is going to be available in a handout form at intermission, and it reflects all of the thoughts that we'll be dealing with this afternoon. So if there's nothing else with respect to the introductions, I think we can begin the conversation here. I've itemized the talk into several sections that are on the agenda sheet that you have, beginning with my personal disappointments with city public government, which in fact led me on the path that I'm now on. Nancy and I are now on. And so this, of course, introduces, makes available an option or complement of private government. Now, private government can exist in a form such as it does at the Sea Ranch, where it's independent of any municipality. But private government may also exist within municipalities, so bear that in mind. I'm going to talk about the history of the development of community associations in the United States, why they exist, what is particular and special about form of government. I'm going to provide you with some an opinion survey conducted by Community Associations Institute on how people feel generally about living in their associations. And I'm going to give some perspectives, my own perspectives, on local government, types of local government that are available to us, i.e. the choices that are available to us when we go shopping for a form of government. And in particular, I'm going to mention the option of creating partnerships between associations and special districts. And I'm going to close with a discussion about what I think we can all do to help improve our associations. There will then be an intermission followed by a question and answer period. And the final sheet in your handout package involves a lead-in to the discussion period. Beginning then with my personal disappointments with city or public government. I've actually had many, and it's a very frustrating position to be in, to be disappointed by your local government. The local government doesn't listen, doesn't care, doesn't want to know, doesn't want to give you a voice, etc., etc. Partly because of my involvement as a community manager, I've had several encounters with public government which have been very difficult to handle. I'm going to lead in, though, with the first one of these that occurred in my life, and which I think was formative in my decision to live in an association and outside of city government. It happened around 1970 in the city of Newport Beach, where the city had, and I didn't really appreciate this at the time I purchased property here, had some commercial expansion aspirations, which turned out to be visible in the form of Fashion Island, for those of you who know Newport Beach, that huge development in Newport Beach area. So that was what they had in mind, but that didn't happen until after we purchased property. It turned out that because of its commercial expansion aspirations, that the city decided that it was going to tap into something called the Richard M. Nixon Law Enforcement Improvement Fund. Now, what the Richard M. Nixon Law Enforcement Improvement Fund enabled the city of Newport Beach to do was to purchase a number of surveillance helicopters. And the city introduced, of course, on a trial basis, it's just a trial, 24-hour, 7-day-a-week helicopter surveillance of everything. Nothing was beyond reach. So there was a significant noise problem because our house was an old house and it had an old gravel roof and everything vibrated, and also a considerable loss of privacy every time you went out into the garden. And so I complained, and many other fellow citizens complained. We formed an anti-helicopter surveillance group. Isn't that a logical thing to do? And we wrote letters to the editor. And I was sort of obsessed with this thing, and I went around the city of Newport Beach armed with a noise meter. Yeah. Took this very seriously. We wrote letters to the editor. We appeared at city council meetings to express our unhappiness with this unwarranted intrusion into our peace and our privacy. Well, the Newport Beach City Council, instead of attempting to address what we thought was a real problem, lifestyle problem, instead, what would you think they did? Yes, yes, they did that. But what was the most insulting part of this of all is they attacked the credibility of the complainants. They said, Mr. Fox, you are not a noise specialist, are you? Do you have a degree in noise? No, sir, my degree is actually in chemistry, but that's beside the point. We have a noise problem. So there was no change to the city's behavior. It continues to this day, if you're ever down there. They've of course purchased additional helicopters, and they're a little bit quieter than they used to be, but it's a dreadful menace. So I was extremely, of course, disillusioned at that point. So what are you going to do about this, John? Well, you can't go on living like this. So I moved to an association-controlled community outside city jurisdiction. It was an association, there were no helicopters, and what's more, the government was made up of my neighbors, who of course wouldn't, if I brought them a complaint, wouldn't say, you're not qualified to bring me that complaint. They would, of course, attempt to deal with it. So that was the first disappointment with public city government. It was autocratic, it had its own direction and agenda, it wasn't really, as I perceived it, wasn't really for the interests of the property owners and the residents. And it certainly was not what I had, as an immigrant to the United States, come to believe in government of the people, by the people, for the people. This was not that, I was quite certain. I had, during my career in my former community, and I'm beginning to sense some of it here, I regret to say, with our dear county. Other brushes and experiences and conflicts with city and county government. In one of those cases, we, the community, the association, we wanted to take over our own water supply, control our own water supply, provide water to our customers. And we thought we'd devised a way to do that, and everybody said no. No way. You are a small community, you are a private community. Our concept for the future of the state of California is large government providing all services under a single umbrella jurisdiction of the city. We're not going to let you do that. The city said no, the adjacent city said no, the county said no, and the Local Agency Formation Commission said no. In fact, our petition to the Local Agency Formation Commission to do this was denied in the same kind of bureaucratic, nonsensical manner. We actually prevailed in the end on that one by filing a request for reconsideration. We hired lobbyists, one particularly effective lobbyist, and We made it our business to get to know everybody on LAFCO much more closely, and it worked in the end. So those are the kinds of experience I've had, and I've felt those experiences quite deeply, because they're not democratic. So, turning back to the 1970s, what had I got myself into in becoming a member of an association? Would it serve me and my neighbors any better? I believe that it did, and I'm going to give you the conclusion that it does, and I'm going to try to explain why I think that. Community associations, as we all know here at the Sea Ranch, govern communities of property owners. There's really nothing more local or accountable in my mind than that kind of government. Our neighbors are surely going to be interested in our opinions and our needs, and that provides some accountability. Of course, associations tax their members in the form of dues, mandatory dues, to pay for services. Associations regulate certain member behaviors, and they operate through elective institutions, although rather than being one person, one vote, the traditional model, it's one unit, one vote. So it's democratic, but there's a different basis. Community associations, I think, enlarge the rights of people to govern themselves within the territorial unit that they have selected, and they allow citizens with common interests and needs to cluster together. It's important to recognize, as I'm sure you will do, that associations aren't legally governments. They are private entities. They're more like corporations in a way. And they're created through covenants attached to deeds to private property. Not created by government decision or decree, but by citizens buying property either from developers or prior owners. So community associations attract people with interests in special amenities. Speaking broadly now, they contain almost all income groups, and volunteers elected by the neighbors are responsible for preserving the community, meeting neighbor expectations, and protecting property values. And perhaps the most wonderful thing of all is that the board members in community associations serve for altruistic reasons. There is no other reason why any sane individual could possibly consider serving on a board of directors of a community association. So it's guaranteed that they have the best interests of the community in mind. Well, what are the ramifications? And I've asked myself this question, and perhaps some of you have asked yourselves this question too. What are we doing? Are we withdrawing from the wider community, involving ourselves in a sort of escapism and an exclusionary lifestyle? Or are we exercising our basic right to live in concert with people like ourselves to address common interests? Or maybe, perhaps, some of each. This is where the literature on private government that I referred to becomes divided. There is quite a lot of literature that says that the former situation applies, that we're escapists and so forth and so on, and this is not to the overall benefit of society in the United States. There appears to be much less literature saying that the second is true, that we're exercising a right to live in concert with people like ourselves to address common interests. But that's my conclusion as to what we're doing. And of course, we ameliorate any feelings that we might have that the former is true by our involvement in the surrounding community. And I think all of us in this room, and certainly the people that I know, really devote themselves with great vigor and interest and commitment to the greater North Coast community, as well as enjoying our lives here at the Sea Ranch. But that is the basic philosophical divide. I'd like to move on now to talk a little bit about the history of community associations. It's kind of interesting. And when one, as I did in preparation for this talk, review some of the literature on this, I discovered some things that I didn't know before I undertook this work. And through some references that I uncovered, the development of community associations in the United States has been divided into 5 different phases, and I'll try to briefly describe what those 5 phases are. The first one, not surprisingly, is origins. And the period of origin of development of community associations extends from about 1830 to 1910. The idea for community association type of living was imported to the United States. And it was imported from, thank you. It was imported from London around 1830. And it was used at that time to protect developments with covenants which restricted uses of the land and proclaimed, for example, what were acceptable drinking habits. So isn't that an illustrious origin? Of course, there were other motives behind development of those restrictions at that time, some of which in today's world we consider distasteful. But that's where it came from. The first association that I've been able to uncover in the United States was St. Francis Wood in San Francisco. And perhaps some of you know that association. I unfortunately haven't had the opportunity to see that firsthand. But I did a little research on it, and the original sort of invitations to purchase property there involved 500 homes equipped with private streets, parks, tennis courts, and covenants establishing detailed architectural and use controls, other restrictions, and a mandatory owners association. In 1998, the San Francisco Examiner took a poll of residents living in St. Francis Wood, and although I haven't been able to uncover the actual poll results, the poll showed that the people living there were among the most satisfied people in the Bay Area. The original advertisements for the selling of the property at St. Francis Wood, when you think about where we are and why we're here, they give some insight, I think, into the origin of association. Restrictions that govern St. Francis Wood protect both home buyers and investors against unpleasant surroundings and property depreciation. They stand, now this is way back, you understand. They stand between the purchaser and the nuisances, such as stables, laundries, and undertaking establishments that ruin neighborhoods and reduce values. They bar the spite fence and the shack, the flat and the apartment house, the corner grocery and the saloon. They guarantee wide lots, none less than 50 feet, freedom from crowding, and so forth and so on. There are but a few hundred protected residence lots in all San Francisco. These most carefully and scientifically protected are in St. Francis Wood. As the value of this protection is demonstrated, prices will increase to twice, 3 times present prices. A wise provision guarantees the attractiveness of St. Francis Wood for all time. This provision is the organization of St. Francis Homes Association. With the purchase of a lot, the buyer is given a share in the association, membership in which is strictly limited to the lot owners in St. Francis Wood. This association will not only manage, but will eventually own all of the community property in St. Francis Wood. To it will be conveyed the parks, tennis courts, gateways, and gardens, all without cost. To St. Francis Homes Association also is given interpretation and enforcement of the wise restrictions that protect St. Francis Wood. In short, the management of all matters that concern St. Francis Wood is placed where it properly belongs, in the hands of the property owners themselves. This guarantees that St. Francis Wood will be able to forever maintain its position as San Francisco's loveliest residence park. So the forces there, even then, were pretty direct, pretty strong, and they sketch in, I think, pretty much what we have all come in some way or other to understand as community associations and the way they are today. In general, however, the early associations didn't have strong central organization, and membership in many was voluntary. There is then, from 1910 to 1935, a second period of development which is called emergence. And during the early 1900s, there were relatively few, and they weren't standardized. But in 1916, zoning was introduced, which began a process of regulating interactions among owners, which could influence the quality of the neighborhood. And there began a demand on developers to establish more associations. In the 1920s, associations gained legal authority to enforce dues payment with the threat of a property lien. This provided a stable source of funds, allowing associations to become more effective and professional. Both developers and residents favored uniformity, making design controls more popular. Then there followed a third period, which is called popularization, in which rapid growth in new associations occurred as land became scarce and construction costs rose. In the early 1960s, federal mortgage insurance system rules were revised to include certain types of associations. So, since the 1960s, local government's role has increasingly been privatized. In 1965, for example, less than 1% of Americans lived in an association. By 2004, 18%, or 52 million people, are living in an association. The rapid growth, as one would expect in this period of popularization, led to some serious growing pains. There were complaints of shoddy construction, assessments not covering costs, lack of clear management responsibilities, and these problems led in 1973 to the formation of CAI, the Community Associations Institute, which today is an association umbrella organization which has an interest in all association work that goes on in the United States, which conducts training courses for managers, provides certifications, educates builders and residents. The next phase, from 63 to 73, is called expansion. Since 1970, 1/3 of all new housing built within a private has been built within a private association. And by the way, this compares with 60% of all new California housing in 2004.
60% in California back then?
Yes. During this expansion phase. In 1970, there were 10,000 associations in the United States. In 2004, there were 260,000, which is greater than the number of public governments in the United States. So we're talking here about, I suppose, and some of the literature uses this word, a revolution in the way we live. Then the final phase, restructuring, involved population explosion and Proposition 13. Proposition 13 changed everything. It reduced public finances available for infrastructure. So this has a profound effect on the way local governments work. So developers and local governments after Prop 13 sought more economic and efficient ways to provide reasonable cost housing, and home buyers wanted low maintenance and recreational facilities. The types of associations that then were constructed, formed, tended to be smaller projects and I would say probably less affluent projects. And the idea was to bring these projects more quickly to market and really to provide less amenities and recreation services. In 1985, California passed the Davis-Sterling Common Interest Development Act. And this is, I'm sure, in a response to many of the problems that had occurred during the period of growth. And this introduced new governance requirements, and it very much increased the state legislature's role in defining relationships between associations and members. In California, 2006, there are more than 41,000 associations in California, comprising 4,300,000 dwellings. This represents 25% of the state's housing stock. So turning now to why community associations exist, the fact of the matter is that the demand for housing has outpaced the ability of local governments to provide services, especially, of course, influenced by Prop 13, forcing a gradual privatization of local government. And in California, the passage of Proposition 13 severely limited city and county revenues. So community associations then come along to cover these costs of service. And I've talked with a number of people involved in city management and county government, and the fact of the matter is that after Prop 13, many developers would not have had their subdivisions approved without an association. So what are the advantages and disadvantages? Advantages are that many special services and facilities can be provided in an association. Disadvantages are that association members may pay twice for services they're taxed for, and which are provided without cost, without extra cost to non-association residents. But associations exist because they offer choices, lifestyle services, amenities, and efficiencies that people want and people value. And the best of them, and I believe that this association is among the very best of them, offers a comforting and to many a critical sense of real community. And I think there are many of us, all of us here in this room, enjoy that sense of community. Yet, associations face some very complicated issues, and among the most challenging of those is balancing the best interests of the community as a whole with preferences of individual residents. And managing this critical, delicate balance is the essence of association governance. And there are other major challenges, financial pressures and constraints. We don't benefit from any public tax revenue. And so our cost base, insurance cost, and the balance between costs and desired services is always an issue. But I come back to the feeling about our form of governance that there's nothing more local, nothing more accountable than those elected by neighbors to governing boards of associations. So while community managers and other professionals provide support, it's volunteers elected by neighbors who are responsible for preserving the community, meeting neighbor expectations, and protecting property values. In California, over 1 million homeowners serve on California boards, and countless others serve on committees. With no exceptions that I've encountered, board members serve for altruistic reasons with the best interests of their community in mind. In 2005, the Community Associations Institute conducted and published a mail survey, and the results of this mail survey are in your handout. I think it's kind of interesting to look at what other people outside the Sea Ranch generally think are the important qualities that we benefit from in associations. And as you can see in the first slide, living in a clean neighborhood, protecting property value, living in a secure neighborhood, a quiet neighborhood. The curb appeal of our homes are all important. Living with neighbors who share values. Having maintenance-free grounds, which is true in many associations, completely maintenance-free. And having swimming pools available, 48%. Interestingly, 70% of these association owners like their communities, 90% trust their boards, and of course 15 to 30% really don't like paying assessments. I think that the reason these kinds of surveys are interesting is because when you go to the media and you read accounts of the sins that are perpetrated in various associations from time to time, they get headline attention. Public might be getting an opinion that this is a very, very bad way to live or a bad form of government. 70% thought that this was a very good overall experience. 20% were neutral. 10% thought it was a bad experience. For board members and managers, 89% thought that board members act in community best interest. That's a remarkable number, I think, especially given and when contrasted with the indifferent experience that I described personally at the beginning. 90% are on friendly terms with board members, 88% positive dealings with managers, 90% either satisfied or neutral with regard to their experience in association. Sort of a vote of confidence. On the effects of rules, 78% thought rules protect and enhance property values, 25% thought there's nothing bad about living in an association. 15% were worried about the restrictions, especially on interior improvements, paying dues, and 35% complained about either out-of-control boards or excessive dues. But interestingly, the member opinion here thought that when members fall in dues arrears, that the association should be direct and forceful in collecting the overdue amounts. There is, of course, in any community of members of anything, certain levels of happiness. A fellow by the name of Robert H. Nelson, who wrote the book on the back of the table here entitled Private Neighborhoods, so he's an authority in associations, says, I have to have the feeling that a lot of the higher unhappiness in associations is associated with smaller associations because a lot of the burden of management falls on the members. Lynn Jordan, president of CAI Foundation, says managers play a key role. Having no manager or an unqualified one is the road to bad press and bad stuff. So in conclusion, all in all, associations appear to represent something worthwhile for about 50 million Americans. That's a lot of people and a lot of associations. I'm one of those 50 million, and I think the number is growing. So how do we preserve and strengthen this private form of government that we select by buying property within an association? I'll get to that in a few minutes. It appears to me, my personal perspectives now on all of this information that I've given you in a very cursory fashion here, is that associations and private governments exist because traditional government cannot provide needed and desired services at the level that many of us want. My experience is that this is denied by city governments, which often take the view that cities providing all services is the only satisfactory local government model. And as illustrated by my personal experience, that model is not for me. One other interesting thing about municipalities is that they're generally averse to special districts, which is another form of public government established to provide necessary but usually limited types of service such as water, wastewater, fire and emergency services, and flood control, etc. There is tension, there is a lot of tension in LAFCO, the Local Agency Formation Commission, between the various representatives of public government. The cities and the special districts are at odds with each other. Cities would like basically nothing better than to see the end of special districts. All special districts want to do is to be able to continue providing the services that they've been chartered to provide. Special districts are an interesting and often ignored form of traditional government. They're quiet, very quiet kind of government. They're formed by the vote of property owners, funded by taxes, and they're able to coexist with cities and associations. So the types of government here are not mutually exclusive. My previous association decided in 1960 to form its own special district by vote of the people to provide sewer service, which had previously been provided by the adjacent city. The city said, annex your association to us or we'll cut off your sewer service. That was a legal move in those days, but it's not legal anymore, thank goodness. But that's what happened, and the city wanted the community's property tax money and it wanted its voters. So So after a real battle of brinkmanship, the special district in my former community was formed, and for 45 years it's been receiving property tax revenues that otherwise would have been dispersed elsewhere. This was a pre-Proposition 13 special district, so that was a very advantageous situation that continues today. Now, the special district cannot spend money on private infrastructure, but since its formation, it's expanded its range of services to include freshwater, flood control, emergency preparedness. And I explained earlier the battle it went through in order to gain the privilege of providing police water service. My perspective on this is that this combination of community association and special district government appears to me to be an effective and ideal local government model. The association provides most of the private services and benefits under the CC&Rs from assessments, and the district provides public works services funded by property tax dollars and by fees. Bringing this discussion closer to the Sea Ranch for a minute, and you'll know this from reading the bulletin, Sonoma County Water Agency, our sewer agency, wishes to relinquish provision of sewer service to the Sea Ranch Association, and we're currently involved in a study evaluating very carefully the pros and cons of the possibility of forming a special district at the Sea Ranch. It's a complex, multifaceted investigation, and our recommendations won't be known for some time. There are a lot of things to look at, and we need to ensure that there'd be adequate reserve funds for infrastructure replacements. Of course, the Sea Ranch property owners would make the ultimate decision on any such proposal if it was brought forward. In a general way, however, my experience previously was that that combination of private and public government worked extremely well and provided for the personal interchange that I think we all value as being an association member, and it also provides a venue for a public works. I'd like to close with a little discussion about what I think we can all do to improve our association.
Can I change tape real quick?
Sure. Which took a Saturday afternoon to come and hear a talk of this kind. These truths will be self-evident to you. We can enhance our associations by recognizing that with extremely rare exceptions, and I haven't encountered one in my career, that board, staff, and volunteers are all people of integrity doing their best. We recognize that there are strong internal checks and balances in our association. There are more internal checks and balances in the Sea Ranch Association than I think I had anticipated there would be. And if you really wanted to do mischief at the Sea Ranch, you'd have a hell of a time pulling it off. So unchecked, improper behavior is really most unlikely. So let's recognize that. I think also it's very helpful to avoid unwarranted criticism, especially criticism not accompanied by supporting facts, which undermines the credibility either of the board or the administration or the community as a whole in the wider community. Avoiding unwarranted criticism is a good way to go. I think that we should look to the board and where appropriate staff to deal with owner and association issues. There is no need, absolutely no need, to cite state law to pressure the board. That is a very, if you think about it, a very kind of insulting thing to do, is to say, I don't trust you, I don't like your answer, I'm going to go to a higher authority. There's no reason to treat our dedicated, non-self-serving board members in that way. Boards are competent, experienced, community-minded, conscientious, and elected by us. We, of course, are obliged to follow the law, and we do so, and we have a very capable attorney who guides us as to how we must comply with the law. We have no intention of not complying with the law, but citing the law to the board or to the administration to sort of get what you want, that you can't get by other means. This is not good. So the board is the first and best resource for local problem solving. We should take our problems to the board if staff have been unable to deal with them, or if it's a policy issue matter. We must take them to the board, and the board will deal with it. And I absolutely know that our board here and the other boards that I've dealt with in my management career would do the same. The first and best resource for local problem solving is right here and right in this room. I think we should recognize that excessive legislation over association affairs in fact results from failings at smaller, underfunded, undermanaged associations. The more established, larger, properly funded and managed associations cost more to operate as a result of most of this legislation, which is for the most part directed at problems that we don't have. Or if we do have the problem, we have the means to resolve them. So, in keeping with my first talk of this kind with you a year ago, I'm promoting unity while honoring sincere disagreement that's based on facts. We must have that in our society, but I'm promoting unity in community. Unified communities can make wonderful things happen for the members. Consuming our resources in unnecessary discord inhibits our progress, and in some cases brings it to a complete halt. I know because that has happened to me elsewhere. And finally, what can we do? We can continue, encourage and nurture the volunteer spirit, which we have in remarkable abundance at the Sea Ranch. I would like to just close by saying a big thank you to all of the Sea Ranch volunteers in every committee, task force, and other ways in which volunteers contribute. You make this community, and together with the board, you make it all happen. I'm here to facilitate. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. The content of this talk will be available on the back shelf during intermission, and you're welcome to help yourselves. After the intermission, I'm going to get questions from you, and we're going to be looking at the last sheet in the agenda here, which is a beginning of an attempt to describe the pros and cons of association living. And I know that when you look at this list, you'll have many that you will want to add, and we can talk about that then. It was at this time last year that some difficult questions were asked, and I particularly remember one of them, and it was from one of our distinguished members of this audience, and the question was, John, what are your weaknesses?
Answer that question.
By now, you all know.
No, I'm sorry.
And we might begin the discussion perhaps. Have you had a chance to look over some of the pros and cons that I sketched out here from talking with members? It might be interesting if, even if we don't discuss it during the question and answer period, if there are pros and cons that occur to you upon reflection, if you just email them to me, I can compile a more complete list. I had a very difficult time coming up with negatives, but perhaps you can add to that. In any case, I'm happy to take your questions.
John, I'll start off. Do I have to use the microphone?
Yes.
Okay.
Who are you, sir?
John, you know me, Roy Austin, 21 Lot 3, but now I've given away my identity, so because, John, I really appreciate what you're doing. And,
Roy, please speak into it.
I really appreciate what you're doing, and I think you're doing exactly what is needed. Having a fireside chat, State of the Association or State of the Union, talking to us on a one-to-one basis on what you feel. And I really, first of all, want to compliment you very, very much for taking the time to do this. I hope you do it every year. Now, if we get bored, we'll let you know. John, I have a question, I guess. Maybe it's not a question. I guess I'd like your perspective, and maybe for the benefit of others here. I've served on the board, I've been on committees, and we have a governance situation. I think Kathy Gordon originally was on a committee that brought it up, that we divide activities into two components. One is called policy, and one is called operational. And I personally have always had a difficulty being only policy if I'm on a board, or only policy if I'm on a policy committee, or only operational if I'm on an operational committee. Now, you have to calibrate me. I'm an engineer and I tend to dabble in everything, so I tend to want to micromanage or get involved in the operational aspects. What I've noticed in the last, 5 years maybe, since the advent of listserv, the day of the beginning, I find many members don't seem to really understand that distinction, and oftentimes will either blame the board for something that's operational, or either blame the manager for something that's policy. And now that you've been here a year, I guess I could ask the question, how are we doing? Do you see things that might be improved to help with that distinction? I think it's a very useful distinction. Keeps the board's hands off of details, and it makes you free to not worry about policy but carry out operations. Could you just comment generally on the value of that and how well it's doing? Thanks.
Well, thank you for the compliment. Appreciate it, Roy. Can you hear me, everybody? It's certainly true that the board bears responsibility for policy, and the staff and I carry responsibility for operations. And we never forget that. I never forget that, and I try very hard to avoid getting into a situation where I'm meddling in a policy issue or decision, or at worst implementing some kind of policy that hasn't been approved by the board. And I think that the key to that relationship is one of collaboration. And as a matter of fact, the original advertisement for the position that I now hold emphasized that the board was looking for a collaborative relationship with its manager. And that so impressed me because that's not such a traditional way of looking at the relationship between the board and the staff. And it's certainly not the city model. The city model is quite different from that. It just happens that that is the way that I like to work, is on a collaborative basis. And the promise that I've made to the board is, I don't know whether I've always been able to keep it, but the promise I've made is, you will never be surprised. And so that, following that tactic means that if the board is never surprised, that means that I have to communicate effectively enough with the board that they are never surprised. So in that process of communication, if the board members think that I'm getting into a policy area with something I have in mind to do, they'll tell me right there and then, so it'll never happen. So my perception is that this aspect of operations and policy here is working well, and I'm also very impressed by the way the board deals with policy. They spend countless hours worrying about which direction to take and how to express it, and they do it in a very not only collaborative but open manner, assuming that it's not things that can't be talked about. I think it's working well.
Good.
Hi, Donna.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Donna Lane, and I live off the corner of Halcyon and Deer Trail. Those of you that are familiar with the area don't need to ask what my question is going to be about. I'd like to not open Pandora's box, but I would like to take a little peek under the lid and would like to know a few things that I don't know about the Sea Ranch Apartments. I don't know where Burbank Housing leaves off, where the Sea Ranch Association takes over any of the responsibilities, the jurisdiction. We do have our own, Sea Ranch Security is down there quite often, and also I know nothing about the managers or what is going on with the managers now. We have a great deal of problem with safety, and I won't go in. I have personal issues with the area, but I won't go into those. I'll try and restrict my questions to the ones that deal with the Sea Ranch in general. We have the traffic problems. We have the park problems down there. We have a problem with coming up now with emergency preparedness and communication. You would be amazed at the officials that are in both counties that have no idea that there is Burbank Housing, and also the residents on the Sea Ranch that are not aware of the housing down there, the domestic violence, the drug problems, and others. So, and I don't know where to start for complaining or asking questions, because I don't know what the Sea Ranch Association's responsibilities are.
Thank you, Donna. I really think that that's sort of an operational, Sea Ranch Association operational issue, and that the forum discussion here about forms of governance and so forth, I had intended that we would talk about things that are not directly involving current issues at the Sea Ranch. So perhaps we should make an appointment for a private discussion, and I can bring in the appropriate resources to deal with the issues. I will say, though, that of course Burbank Housing is a separate entity, but part of the association, managed by the Burbank Housing Group. And we converse with the managing director of Sea Ranch Apartments to try to resolve problems and issues. The management situation at the apartments has been going through a state of flux in the last few months, and it was announced that the managers, Tony and May Vasquez, were leaving effective July the 11th or thereabouts. So we were waiting for Burbank Housing to appoint a replacement manager. We didn't hear anything from them. People wondered what was going on. It turns out that Tony and May are back. And according to Tony, with whom I have recently had a conversation since his return, his wife, May, is going to assume the major responsibility for management there, while Tony, I think, has taken more of a off-Sea Ranch ministerial type position. I'm aware of a small number of complaints that have to do with the appearance of the area. I haven't had any behavioral issues come to my attention, except those that you bring to me now. And so I think, if you don't mind, we should sit down and discuss this and involve the appropriate staff members. I've, of course, urged the security department to be especially concerned and vigilant in the area, and I believe that they're doing that. So can we talk about that privately?
Oh, yes, I did make an appointment, but you were ill. But it's just it's a special situation between the association and, it does have a little bit to do with the government of the association.
I'd be glad to sit down and talk with you about it.
Yeah, John, my name is Jamie Edwards. I too am celebrating my 1-year anniversary. My wife and I arrived here at the same time you did, so we're 1-year anniversary people.
How's it been?
Been great. And so far, I haven't followed you closely, but from what I hear, everything's going great. I would like to ask generally your thoughts about the issue. I don't know, there's a wide range of types of associations. On the issue of associations where a substantial portion are for rent to non-members, can you speak to that generally? Where do we stand relative to others? What issues does it introduce to the problem of governance? Do you have experience with that? And that general topic, so just kind of pick that up and go with it, would be great.
All right, thank you. My former community was 10% of properties were for rent during the summer season. So the problems arose generally in summer season, and they arose because, to a significant degree, people who come here to rent property or to that community to rent property haven't had a good introduction to the rules, the standards and values and so forth and so on. So they have a tendency to sort of create a separate community within a community, and a community that's not really connected. And I realize that here at the Sea Ranch, the proportion of rental properties is significantly higher than in my former community. It creates operational problems, operational issues. Whether or not it creates policy issues so much, I'm not sure, because the degrees of freedom that the rental people have is really, defined in our governing documents. So there isn't too many degrees of freedom. As the manager, I feel that I feel very comfortable and integrated with and conversational with the full-time residents of the community and those who come here regularly at weekends and so forth. I do not feel comfortable with the tenant population because I rarely get to meet them, and it's uncomfortable to me, since one of my goals is to sort of help create a united community. It's uncomfortable to me to know that there's a segment of the people resident here who, just by force of circumstance, are separate, are not really part of the community in a community sense. And if, of course, there's an emergency in the community, a disaster in the community, it's going to create communication problems which are going to be very difficult to deal with. This is one reason why I think that having a community service access channel on our cable system would provide some tools that we don't currently have to deal with this. On the managers network across the country, which I participate in more or less on a daily basis, the issue and the problems created by, the problems as we perceive them, created by the tenant community is often referred to and with a considerable amount of frustration by most managers.
I'm Debbie Tyler. I have two questions totally unrelated. One, in terms of your list of pros and cons, I'm wondering if a con might not be that long-term renters, as opposed to vacation renters, are totally disenfranchised or effectively disenfranchised from participation in association affairs, although they may be living here for quite some time in the house. The other issue is Davis Sterling, and the fact that we seem in the past to have been blindsided by changes in the Davis Sterling Act. I'm wondering if through the Community Association Institute or other means we're doing a better job of tracking and perhaps even lobbying to make sure that we're not saddled with state legislation that really changes the character of our community.
Thank you, Debbie. On the first question, of course, since this is a one vote per property kind of foundation for our system here, I suppose it's inevitable that long-term renters in that sense will be disenfranchised. However, from the manager's point of view, I will gladly embrace anybody who wants to associate themselves in some way with community activities and the association. By our governing documents, tenants are considered members as far as the use of grounds and so forth is concerned. And so I would like very much to open our arms and our hearts and minds to whoever wants to associate themselves with us, sort of full-time people here. And no, I really mean that, but it's hard to accomplish, and maybe we need to communicate that that's how we would like it to be. I certainly am totally against any kind of differentiation among types of people who live here, because we come here all for different reasons. And certainly the property owners who are leasing their properties have a right to expect that their tenants will be embraced and treated properly. Regarding the Davis Sterling, that's my perspective. Regarding the Davis Sterling problems, they are a serious problem for the association and all other California associations. They're a problem with the intensity of change, the complexity of the legislation, and it's frustrating. Much of the legislation that's put into effect is not really directed at a well-managed, well-governed association. It's directed at the outliers on the Gaussian curve who are misbehaving. And so the recent election legislation, for example, that imposes all kinds of new requirements and constraints on how the election is conducted. I've never been involved in an association election that was anything but proper. And all of the people running the election committee, and so forth and so on, have done a great job and an honest job of making sure that the right thing was done. And in the case of the Sea Ranch, we have even a professional election service that basically does the job for us to ensure impartiality and correctness. Yet we're faced with this really complex and radical change as to how we conduct elections. And what the legislature is trying to do with this legislation is move private associations more towards the public election system as fast as they can. And the whole thing is triggered by I don't know what you call them, rogue associations or some term like that that describes people behaving badly. In terms of keeping track of these legislative changes, this is a major job. And both Sea Ranch Advising Council and I are on various electronic alert systems that keep us apprised of what's going on, what's being proposed, draft legislation. This is an enormous amount of material to read and digest and comprehend its significance of while we're trying to run an association that has its own intense demands. It's a problem, and frankly it's out of control. And I attend an annual conference of association managers regarding law changes in California, put on by the California Association. The attorneys who give these courses and updates and reminders and so forth, this is what you have to do, are completely nonplussed at what they have to deal with in terms of advising the association about how to respond to new legislation. So you have these really distinguished, experienced counsel to the best associations in the state saying, I don't really know what to do, George. What do you think we should do? Well, maybe we should have a meeting. And then the attorneys will get together and they'll try and interpret what was the meaning of the legislation. All of the time, it's hanging over our head in terms of something we have to implement, usually at very short notice. The California Association of Community Managers is very vigilant and maintains a full-time legislative analyst staff in Sacramento and they solicit input from the managers whenever they feel that our input will be helpful in turning back some unhelpful legislation. It's going on all the time. There's an undercurrent of new legislation sort of every day, every week, and that's how we try to keep a handle on it, is through our California professional body. As far as whether an individual association could enter into the legislative arena and try to effect political change, I don't think that's realistic. I think that any individual community is acting on its own is not going to be heard. We're dealing, after all, with public government. So I wish I could be more encouraging. It's a pretty bleak picture. All we can do is try to stay on top of it, understand what's going on and what we're going to be faced with, and we're called upon by our professional body to get in there and support the positions that they're taking.
My name is Walt Custer. I'm in 346, and the question I'm going to ask kind of bridges on member privacy issues, so I expect I'm not asking for a personal answer, I'm asking for a general answer. My sense is that a small group of individuals at Sea Ranch take up a lot of staff time by requests. Now, I can't quantify that, but for lack of a better word, I sense there's a couple of squeaky wheels in the community that make repetitive requests on you and the staff. Now, maybe that's an unfounded assumption, but could you comment is if a lot of your staff time is being taken up by a few individuals, and if so, what can we do to diminish that so they can be spent on things that were for the good for all of us rather than for the good of one or two, and also avoid maybe a lot of background legal advice that we'd have to use in dealing with the people that keep on making these requests?
You're right, that is a difficult issue to deal with. My experience is that it is a problem, and I don't have any quantitative information that would describe the impact that it has or the dollar impact that it has, but I believe that it has a dollar impact that's not insignificant. And I think that this is an issue that the board is now beginning to contemplate and consider and deal with, and I would expect them to continue to do so.
Is there anything that the members can do to help?
If you think back to the closing remarks at the end of the first hour, Walt, I made some suggestions there that in a general way are sort of intended to move us towards more unity and to stop spinning our wheels where we don't need to spin our wheels. I think that the vast majority of members understand the impact that something like that can have, and that by the power of personal neighbor-to-neighbor persuasion have opportunities perhaps to influence others.
I'm Don Kemp, Unit 191. This is really going to be easy for you, especially after last. So, the Sea Ranch has a couple of characteristics that I think lend themselves to this type of governance. It's an intentional community. I mean, people tend to live here because they wanted to come here. They're not transferred here by IBM or something. And secondly, the vast majority of the permanent residents and the regular visitors are no longer working full-time, if at all. And most of them are reasonably well-accomplished individuals and used to doing things, and therefore have the time and the expertise to do all the volunteer things that are going around here. I'm just wondering if is that
typical of the successful communities of this sort? Or is it, I mean, how widespread does this governance model work across our society? Does it tend to be concentrated in units like this? How would it work in downtown New York or Oakland or something like that?
The governance model is widespread throughout the United States, as you know, evidenced by the number of associations and the growth in numbers of associations. I get to visit other associations at our annual managers conference and get 3 days of in-depth insight into other associations, really across the United States. And what is wonderful, really, about what I've been talking about in terms of private governance, what I see as wonderful is that the structure, the basic structure, is the same across the country, and whether we're a large association or a rural association or an urban association, the structure is the same. And the challenges, there's a lot of commonality among the challenges that we all face. And so it's heartening to me to know that when I have a problem, I can reach out to these other communities and get insight and advice, and I do that often. The associations that I've observed and visited all have strong volunteer components. They have committees, they have committee charters, and so we compare notes at these managers' meetings about what committees we have and what the charters look like. So that part of the model is also common and consistent throughout the country. What I think is different at the Sea Ranch, and which I take a lot of pride in, even though I didn't have anything to do with creating it, is that the intensity and numbers of people who are willing to contribute significant amounts of time and expertise to the welfare of the association is very, very high. And I have no way to measure it, but I can't imagine that there's an association anywhere in the country that exceeds our volunteer commitment and our committee health, if you want, even though, you know, there's some problems with it, we're trying to improve it. So, full marks to all of my predecessors and the founders of the community and the boards and the members who've deliberately cultivated this culture of volunteerism. I think it's superb.
Jim Docker, 2143. John, along those same lines, I'm curious about design committees and how many of these 250,000 associations have, say, robust, I would call it a robust design committee as we have, and whether that relates to the success of those communities or the relative contentment of the association members if they do have a strong, robust design committee. Is there any information or do you have impressions on that from your conversations with others?
Yes, I think I do. There's a strong contrast between my former association and this one in terms of design committee operation. So it's been valuable to me to see how this one operates and maybe to be able to compare the results between the two. And of course I hear about design committees at other associations. The normal structure is that, I mean, the prevalent structure is that design committee reports to the board of directors, and the board of directors makes the final say on design submittals. That's the way it was at my former community. Here, of course, the design committee operates as a separate entity and is not subject to, decisions are not subject to review by the board except at time of appeal. A relatively recent introduction. It's my belief that if the member's preference and the community interest is in maintaining a particular kind of architectural standard or sort of use of the land, that the independent design committee is probably the only way it's going to work. The problem that I perceive with a design committee that reports to the board of directors is that inevitably the board of directors gets politicked by the members submitting designs, and the board of directors, being an elected body and of course also highly interconnected within the community, is going to be more susceptible to poor non-architectural decisions than one like ours, which is independent. So if I look at community development, community health, and so forth and so on, if you want a community that's sort of maxed out in terms of the land use, buildings to the max, to the property line, to the height limit, all the parameters maxed out, then you go with the model where the design committee reports to the board of directors. If you want something that's more constrained than that, and perhaps which honors the founders' ideals, then you go with the Sea Ranch model.
Is there a way of discovering, if you are about to move into a community, what type of relationship the design committee may have with their board of directors?
Yes, Jim, it's defined in the CC&Rs. It's very clear, if you read the CC&Rs, which type of governance you're in.
John, I'm interested in your statements about community services district. And since you've had experience with having an association board that also had a community services district, were there any pluses or minuses? Did you have a separate board, or were the association board was the CSD board?
Thank you, Kathy. My former association, the two boards were separate. One association board was 7 members, the district board was 5. The district board members, of course, are open to public election. It worked, that arrangement worked extremely well in my former community. There was a mutually supportive relationship between the two boards. There probably wasn't as much communication as there should have been, and there probably wasn't as much mutualization of goals as there should have been. The district board was more stable. It was, it had board members who were elected time and again. They were all very good people, professional people, lawyers, CPAs, so forth. The association board, however, in my former community, had a similar kind of rotating membership as the Sea Ranch board does. And they had a nominating committee which nominated candidates for the board, unlike the Sea Ranch, where nominations are independent of any such committee. The turnover in that association board was such that there was an unpredictability about it, and the nominations committee really had a hard time figuring out whether or not person X would actually make a good board member. So there were one or two sort of misfit type situations that caused a lot of wheel spinning. At the Sea Ranch, with the Sea Ranch system, while I've only really had 1 year, 1 full year, and then sort of a partial year to observe, that the system here has worked very well. So I haven't been yet faced with that kind of sort of unpredictable situation in the board. I personally think that the Sea Ranch, being a much larger community than my former one, and more diverse in the sense of we have these mixes of different interests. We're not all sort of either retired or backwards and forwards on the freeway every day to work. So it's a different situation, and there are also some differences in the, I think in the fundamental sort of educational background and so forth, which at the Sea Ranch is very, very high indeed. Down south there tended to be more business entrepreneurial people. My persuasion is that at the Sea Ranch, a single board, if a CST ever became seriously contemplated here, that it would be very good to think in terms of a single board, because it provides a built-in unity of purpose and direction and strategy and planning that is hard to achieve with two separate boards. So if there's a way to achieve that, and we've been advised that there is a way to achieve that, if that's the community's desire and intent, I think that would be the best arrangement.
My feeling in having had to analyze the budgets of the county in terms of both sewer zones is the sooner that we can get out from under the county, the better.
Are you speaking about specifically sewer service or in general? You speak?
Sewer service.
I understand your views, and I'm sympathetic. Are there any other questions? Well, thank you so much for joining my family and me today. Nancy, Janet, and Clive. And we're going to take a short break now. And, I'm going to get to know the local area for the first time. I've been here a year and I haven't been north of Elk. So we're going to really branch out and go to Mendocino. I really appreciate it. We really appreciate being part of this community and for your support and warmth. And thank you all so very much indeed.